The official history of the Rothschild family has a gap in it. Not a small one. Not the kind of gap you can attribute to poor record-keeping or the passage of time. It is a specific, datable, quantifiable rupture in the biographical record. A moment where a family of modest means in a Frankfurt ghetto becomes, within the span of roughly 2 decades, the single most powerful financial force in Europe. The official story waves at this gap with vague references to shrewd trading and good timing. But when you sit down with the actual documents, the ledgers, the letters, the parliamentary inquiries, the archive-finding guides, the wave becomes insufficient. The gap remains, and that gap is what this script is about. We are not going to talk around it. We are going to walk directly into it. The standard account of the Rothschild rise is familiar enough to feel settled. Mayer Amschel Rothschild, born in 1744 in the Judengasse, the Jewish ghetto of Frankfurt, built a coin-dealing and antique business. He cultivated the patronage of Wilhelm IX, Landgrave of Hesse-Cassels, managed some of his funds, and through 5 sons strategically placed across the capitals of Europe, constructed a banking empire. Nathan in London, James in Paris, Salomon in Vienna, Karl in Naples, Amschel in Frankfurt. Coordination through coded letters, discretion as currency. That is the story. Clean, coherent, almost elegant. But the documentary record, when examined carefully, does not fully support that elegance. And the place where it breaks down most visibly is 1810. Before 1810, there is no documented record of Rothschild wealth at a scale that would explain what came after. Mayer Amschel's estate at the time of his death in 1812 was valued at roughly 190,000 gulden, a comfortable sum for a Frankfurt merchant, but not a foundation for what followed. Within 15 years of that death, his son Nathan Mayer Rothschild in London was arranging sovereign loans that dwarfed the annual revenue of mid-sized European states. The question is not whether the rise happened. It demonstrably did. The question is whether the explanation offered for how it happened holds together arithmetically, archivally, or historically. Mayer Amschel Rothschild began as a dealer in rare coins and metals. His connection to Wilhelm IX of Hesse-Cassel, one of the wealthiest princes in the German states, was genuine and well documented. Wilhelm was known across Europe as a lender of mercenary troops, most famously to the British during the American Revolutionary War, and he accumulated enormous capital through those transactions. The court-Jew arrangement, where a Jewish financier handled the sovereign's money in exchange for protection and business, was a known institutional structure across German principalities. Mayer Amschel operated within it. Mayer Amschel's early correspondence with Wilhelm, preserved in part at the Institute for City History in Frankfurt, shows a man working hard for relatively small commissions. He was not, in the 1790s, a figure of European financial significance. He was a capable, well-connected regional merchant. That much the record supports clearly. Now, do the arithmetic. If Mayer Amschel's estate in 1812 was approximately 190,000 gulden, and Nathan Mayer Rothschild in London was, by 1818, leading a consortium that issued a £5 million sovereign loan to Prussia, equivalent in purchasing power to something approaching £400 million today, then the compounding required to bridge those two figures in 6 years is not merely impressive. It is, under normal commercial conditions, implausible. The math does not work through organic growth alone. Something else was happening, and the official account does not specify what that something else was with the precision the numbers demand. The window that matters, the window the official account acknowledges but does not fully explain, is the period between roughly 1806 and 1815. These are the Napoleonic Wars years. Nathan Mayer Rothschild in London was involved in transmitting British subsidies to Wellington's forces on the Iberian Peninsula and to Allied powers on the continent. This is documented. The British government needed to move gold across a war-torn continent, and Nathan Rothschild developed a mechanism for doing it. Buying gold in London, routing it through complex chains of bills of exchange. he was paid commissions for this service. Those commissions, combined with his trading operations, are cited as the core of his wartime accumulation. But here is where the institutional context becomes critical, and where the official account becomes genuinely evasive. The British Treasury records from this period do not provide a complete accounting of the commission structure Nathan received. The Bank of England archives, which hold related documentation, are partially accessible, but the finding guides for the relevant collections acknowledge gaps in the correspondence files from 1808 to 1814. These are not dramatic admissions. They are bureaucratic notations, but they matter. When an archive's own finding guide tells you that the files for exactly the years you need are incomplete, you are not dealing with a conspiracy. You are dealing with what archivists call a structural preservation problem. And structural preservation problems tend to cluster around records that are either very fragile or very sensitive. The Rothschild Archive in London, established in 1978 and professionally maintained, is the primary repository for the family's own business records. The archive is real, staffed by serious archivists, and has supported legitimate scholarship. The archive's own publications acknowledge that the early Frankfurt correspondence, the records from Meyer-Amschel's period, are fragmentary. Letters are missing. Account books from the critical 1806 to 1815 period are incomplete. The archive does not claim these records were destroyed deliberately. It attributes the gaps to the ordinary hazards of documents survival. That explanation is plausible. It is also structurally convenient, because the records whose absence is most consequential for evaluating the origin story happen to be exactly the records that are most incomplete. This is not a conspiracy argument. It is an archival argument. When the evidentiary gaps concentrate precisely at the explanatory juncture, the moment when modest means were supposed to have become enormous wealth, the incompleteness of the record is not neutral. It functions as cover, regardless of whether it was designed to. The structural incentive to preserve flattering records and allow unflattering ones to decay is a pattern across elite financial families. Now, at this point, a particular school of interpretation enters the room. There is a heterodox tradition, running from 19th century pamphlets through 20th century populist movements to contemporary internet discourse, that attributes the Rothschild rise not to wartime commissions and superior coordination, but to something more deliberate and more conspiratorial. The most specific version claims that Nathan Rothschild had advance knowledge of Wellington's victory at Waterloo in June 1815, used that knowledge to manipulate the London bond market by first selling, triggering panic, and then buying at depressed prices. This story was repeated in political pamphlets, in anti-Semitic propaganda, and more recently in financial history books. Here is what serious engagement with that claim looks like. The Waterloo story has a documented origin in an 1846 pamphlet by Georges Mathieu d'Erneville, a French anti-Rothschild polemicist whose work was explicitly political and whose sourcing was not rigorous. The specific claim about Nathan manipulating consols on June 20, 1815 has never been substantiated from primary sources. Historians examined the console price records from that period and found no evidence of a dramatic single-day movement. The console prices in the days following Waterloo show a gradual recovery, not a sudden spike consistent with a calculated buy-low operation. So the specific Waterloo manipulation claim is not established by evidence. But, and this is the part that the debunking exercise tends to elide, legitimate core of the heterodox question is not actually about Waterloo. It is about the arithmetic we already walked through. It is about the gap between 190,000 gulden in 1812 and sovereign loan leadership by 1818. Dismissing the Waterloo story does not answer that question. The debunking of the myth does not fill the gap. The heterodox tradition, for all its ideological contamination, is pointing at a real anomaly, even when it explains that anomaly incorrectly. The question is legitimate. The most widely circulated answer is not supported by evidence. Zoom out now, because the Rothschild anomaly does not stand alone. The period from roughly 1800 to 1830 produced a striking cluster of financial dynasties across Europe whose origins share a structural resemblance to the Rothschild pattern. Modest or undocumented pre-war origins, followed by dramatic post-Napoleonic War wealth, followed by sovereign lending and government bond underwriting that placed them at the center of European state finance. The Barings in Britain, Hope and Company in Amsterdam, the pattern of wartime financial intermediation producing peacetime financial dominance is not unique to the Rothschilds. It is a systemic feature of the Napoleonic War's economic landscape. What distinguishes the Rothschild case is two things. First, the scale of the post-war position is extraordinary even within this peer group. By the 1820 to 1820s, they were the dominant arranger of European sovereign debt. Second, the pre-war baseline for the Rothschilds is dramatically lower than for their contemporaries. The Barings had been in business since 1762. The Rothschilds had no comparable institutional history. Their emergence was faster from a lower base to a higher peak. That combination, faster, lower, higher, is what makes the arithmetic so difficult and the gap so visible. By the 1820s and 1830s, the Rothschild network was not merely managing money for governments. It was, in a meaningful structural sense, the mechanism through which European governments accessed capital markets. When Austria needed to refinance its war debts in 1820, it was the Rothschilds who arranged the loan. When France needed to raise the indemnity imposed after Waterloo, 700 million francs, it was a Rothschild-led syndicate that managed it. The historians who study the period of European state finance from 1815 to 1870 are, by professional necessity, working with sources that the Rothschild network touched, shaped, and in some cases funded. This is not a claim that historians were bribed or corrupted. It is a claim about structural incentive. The same kind of structural incentive that explains why an archives finding guide acknowledges gaps without anyone feeling the need to investigate what caused them. The questions that were not asked about the Rothschild origin story during the 19th century were not suppressed through active censorship. They were not asked because the people who might have asked them were professionally embedded in a world where the Rothschilds were an institution to be engaged. The muckraking tradition that did ask pointed questions, in pamphlets, in populist newspapers, in the speeches of figures like William Jennings Bryan, was dismissed as ideologically motivated and frequently was ideologically contaminated. The contamination made it easy to dismiss the questions along with the questioners. And so the arithmetic gap, the archival gaps, the comparative pattern, none of it received the sustained, rigorous, primary source investigation it warranted. Parliamentary inquiries in Britain periodically touched on sovereign debt arrangements. These records exist. They are in the parliamentary archives. They reference Rothschild-led loans by name. They do not, in any systematic way, ask where the Rothschild capital originated. The question was not on the agenda because the loans were being evaluated for their current terms, not their historical provenance. That is also, structurally, how the gap survived institutional scrutiny without being examined. So here is where we land. No recorded wealth before 1810. Within 2 decades, the dominant force in European sovereign debt. Wartime commissions as the official explanatory bridge, real, documented, but arithmetically insufficient at the scale required. Archival gaps concentrated precisely at the explanatory juncture, acknowledged by the archives themselves. A peer group of contemporaneous financial dynasties showing a similar pattern of Napoleonic War-era emergence. A heterodox interpretive tradition pointing at the right anomaly with the wrong specific explanation. Contaminated by ideology, but not thereby wrong about the existence of the gap. A scholarly infrastructure with structural incentives to engage the Rothschilds as partners rather than as subjects of origin inquiry. The untapped primary sources are known. The Bank of England correspondence files from 1808 to 1815. The complete Hessian treasury records relating to Wilhelm IX's capital movements, some held at the Hessian State Archive in Marburg. The full run of Nathan Mayer Rothschild's Bill of Exchange records from his Manchester textile trading period, which preceded his London banking operation and which have never been systematically analyzed in published scholarship. The records of the British Commissariat, the government office that managed Wellington's supply funding, which interfaced directly with Nathan's gold transmission network, and which exist at the National Archives at Kew, largely uncatalogued for this specific purpose. These are not secret documents. They are not locked vaults. They are ordinary archival collections that ordinary researchers with ordinary credentials could examine. They have not been examined systematically because the question they would address has not been treated as a serious scholarly priority. That is not a conspiracy. It is a failure of intellectual will. The gap between what the Rothschilds demonstrably had before 1810 and what they demonstrably controlled by 1825 is one of the most striking quantitative anomalies in the history of modern finance. It deserves the same rigorous, primary source, arithmetic-driven investigation that we would apply to any other claim of wealth creation at comparable scale in comparable time. The absence of that investigation is not evidence of a cover-up. It is evidence of something more mundane, and in some ways more troubling, a field that has made peace with a gap it has never fully measured, in a story it has never fully told. The gap is still there. The arithmetic still does not close, and the sources that might close it are sitting in archives, uncatalogued, waiting for someone to decide the question is worth asking.